감사합니다. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back in Korea. It's my first time in Busan, so thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be on this stage. As mentioned, I work at the Happiness Research Institute in Copenhagen, and we are a think tank essentially trying to answer 3 questions. We try to figure out how we can measure the good life or happiness. Secondly, why some people are happier than others. And thirdly, how we can improve quality of life. And it's also those 3 questions I'll try to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. I should also mention that I know when you work with happiness research, a lot of people imagine that our offices look somewhat like this, and we have a room full of ice cream and a room full of puppies. Unfortunately, that's not the case. It looks more like this. So we have a scientific approach to happiness. And using data, using evidence, using academic studies, how are we going to design our cities, our workplaces, our societies, our policies differently? That's the aim of our research. I should also mention that the country we get most visits from at the Happiness Research Institute is South Korea. We get visits from academics, from journalists, from mayors, from politicians. And I think it's because there's this real thirst in Korea for the knowledge that is being provided by this conference. I think there is a real recognition that the way we've been organizing society is perhaps not leading us to a happy society. And as mentioned also by our MC and by Mr. Roy and in the presentation, you guys have had an amazing growth over the past few generations and gone from a much poorer country to one of the richest countries in the world, and that's wonderful. But I think the key challenge here is figuring out how do we convert that wealth into well-being. How do we spend our money wisely to deliver quality of life for people? So I think that's the key question that you should try to answer, that I'm trying to answer, and hopefully this conference will be able to deliver some answers to. Also, it's a wonderful thing to notice how much is happening globally with happiness and politics these years. So we're actually seeing more and more organizations, more and more governments, more and more international organizations embracing happiness research and new softer measures of progress. So for us, it's been a milestone that the UN passed a happiness resolution back in 2011. And that resolution essentially asks for all countries of the world to focus more on happiness and see what they can do to improve quality of life for people. We see governments, also in Europe, starting to measure progress, not just in terms of wealth, but also in terms of quality of life. I think the UK in Europe has probably gone the furthest. Every year, almost 200,000 people in the UK are being surveyed in terms of happiness levels. Interestingly, we also see some of the richest countries embracing these new measures of progress. So this is Her Excellency Uhud Al-Rumi. She is the Minister of State for Happiness in the United Arab Emirates. So the Emirates are the 7th richest country in the world. Now their official ambition is to become one of the happiest countries in the world. So her job is to get the Emirates to top 5 in the World Happiness Report by 2021. And I think it's wonderful to see one of the richest countries moving towards these softer measures of progress. I think the reason why we see more countries is going in this direction is that there's a recognition that the way we've been measuring progress is incomplete. So this graph behind me shows the economic development in Egypt leading up to the revolution, the Arab Spring in 2011. And we see the same development in Tunisia. So if you look at the economic development, things look like they're going fine. There was a 33% increase in that 5-year period. But if we look at the amount of people who felt that their lives were flourishing, that life was good, that share drops to 1/3 of what it used to be. So this is from an OECD report concluding that these measures that capture well-being, that capture happiness, are better to measure the actual progress in a society. Which brings us to one of the key questions. How do we measure happiness, well-being, quality of life? The trouble with all of these concepts is that they are very wide. So Mr. Park has one idea of what happiness is, Mr. Roy has another, I have a third. And what we need to do when we meet these wide terms is we need to break them down and look at the different components. It's also what we do when we talk about other complex phenomena like the Korean economy. We break that down and talk about inflation, growth, GDP per capita, interest rates, and so on. And that gives us a language to talk about how is the Korean economy doing. So that's the same thing we need to do with happiness. So when we measure happiness at the Happiness Research Institute, we use the guidelines from OECD. And there we have at least 3 different components, 3 different dimensions of happiness. So first of all, we measure life satisfaction. And that is essentially where we take a step back and evaluate our lives. So considering the worst possible life we could lead, the best possible life we could lead, where do we feel we stand right now? That is the dimension that is usually fed into the World Happiness Report. I think you'll see the results out in front of the hall here. And that's a very stable measure of happiness. People usually answer the same today as they did 2 weeks ago. Another dimension is often captured with surveys going out on phones. And here we ask people how happy they are right now. What are they doing? We know what day of the week it is. We can look at GPS data and see where are people more or less happy in the country. And we can see, yes, no big surprise, people are happier in the weekends than they are on Mondays and Tuesdays. So there's a very volatile dimension to happiness as well. And they are, of course, also linked. If you have an everyday with positive emotions, with high levels of happiness on a daily basis, you probably also report high levels of life satisfaction. The third level, that was mentioned earlier here by Aristotle. The good life is the meaningful life. So there we use Aristotle's perception of what the good life was and use the ancient Greek word for happiness, which is eudaimonia. So that's the third dimension. So we break it down, we look at the different components, then we acknowledge that we as individuals are the best judges of whether we are happy or not. There's nobody here more equipped to tell you whether I'm happy or not than me. But yes, it is subjective, the same way that depression, that stress, that loneliness are also subjective phenomena. And I don't see any reason why it should be more difficult to study a positive emotion than a negative emotion. What we also like to do when we study happiness is we like to follow people over time. So we could follow you and 10,000 other people from Busan over the next 10 years, because over the next decade, a lot of things are going to happen in your lives. People are going to get married, some people are going to have kids, some people are going to get promoted, some people are going to get fired. And we like to see what is the average impact from those life events on the different dimensions of happiness. And here, for instance, are some results from a European study where they have followed people over decades and can see the average effect of marriage on happiness. So over 10 years, 1,700 people get married, and the marriage happens in year 0. Women are the red line and men are the blue line. And yeah, we can see there is an impact on happiness from marriage. We adapt over time. But we can also then start to understand some of the causes and effects in these measures. Because if we only look at a given point of time, we can see that people who are married are on average happier. But we don't necessarily know whether you get happy from marriage or it's the other way around, that those people who are happy have an easier time getting married. We can see that when we follow people over time. And actually both things are true. So as mentioned, Denmark often do well in the happiness rankings, together with the other Nordic countries. Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Denmark all do well in the World Happiness Report, together with Switzerland, the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. South Korea is currently 57th, but there's 155 countries in the World Happiness Report. So the least happy countries in the World Happiness Report right now is Syria, Burundi, Central African Republic. So you're almost in the top third. Then the question is, of course, why do the Nordic countries often do well? And when we look across all the countries in the World Happiness Report, we can actually see that we can explain the majority of the difference in happiness levels with relatively few factors. And I'll focus on the first four in this presentation. So yes, we know that money does matter for happiness. We can see on average, richer people are happier, richer countries are happier. But there's a lot of complexity in this. So this is the overall picture. The relationship between GDP levels, which you have on the horizontal line, and happiness levels upwards. So as a group, yes, richer countries are happier than poorer countries. But the countries that are above the green line, those countries are really good at converting their wealth into well-being. So they get a lot of happiness per dollar, right? And as you'll see, South Korea is below the line. So you should actually be happier than you are according to your economic levels. You have roughly the same happiness levels as Singapore and Paraguay, even though Singapore is quite high up in terms of GDP. And you have the same GDP levels as almost Finland, which is currently the happiest country in the world. So you could actually be one of the happiest countries in the world with the GDP levels you have if we invested the money more wisely. Okay? So looking at individual level, this is European data. Again, we have income levels outwards, so richer people on the right, and then we have happiness levels upwards. And yes, richer people are on average happier, but that's because being without money is a cause of unhappiness. As you'll see here, if we move from low income to middle income, that's a big increase in happiness, but going from middle income to high income doesn't really impact our happiness levels. So with money, as with everything else, there is diminishing marginal return. The more we have of something, the less pleasure we get out of it, right? The first piece of cake, wonderful. Piece number 5, not so great, right? It's the same with money. The more we have of them, the less we spend them on crazy things like gold-plated iPhones and so on. Okay. So when it comes to money, we also care about our relative income. So not just the absolute income, how much money do we make, but our relative income, how much money do we make compared to everybody else, right? So we care about our position in the social hierarchy. So that's why when we sometimes see a country double its GDP per capita, happiness levels remain the same because everybody's still in the same place in the social hierarchy. It's also an element in how we redistribute wealth. In Denmark, the other Nordic countries have some of the highest taxation levels in the world. So I pay around 45% of my income in tax. But together with the majority of Danes, I'm happy to pay those taxes because it goes into schools, it goes into hospitals. And I think the perception of tax in the Nordic countries is that we see it as an investment in a collective quality of life for people. So my happiness also depends on how is my neighbor doing and how is my neighbor's children doing. And I think that makes a great society if we understand that my happiness also depends on your happiness. And yes, it's spent on universal healthcare, free education, and so on. But I think it's also an element when it comes to cities, how we invest our money. And a few years ago, I visited Kuala Lumpur. And it's a wonderful city, invested a lot in infrastructure in the past few years, but it's infrastructure for cars. So I was trying to walk over to the botanical garden, which was a few hundred meters from my hotel, but gave up because they've left out pavement for pedestrians and they've left out cycling paths for cyclists. And I think if you forget cyclists, if you forget pedestrians, and only create roads for cars and cities for cars, then you're telling people that if you do not own a car, you are a second-rate citizen. I like cities where pedestrians, people walking, people cycling, are treated like the kings and queens of the road. And to me, that's what makes Copenhagen great, is that I can get around everywhere I need to go in Copenhagen without a car. I don't own a car because I don't need a car. So there are bridges for cyclists, for pedestrians. There are trash cans so you can throw your coffee cup in the trash can while you're cycling. And it's just little things that makes you as a cyclist feel appreciated. And I think that's what great cities do. They remove the price tag there is on happiness. They create great public spaces that we can all enjoy, whether we are rich or whether we are poor. By the way, this is me swimming in the harbor, in the central harbor of Copenhagen. They've cleaned up the water so you can go swimming after work. And that is something I can enjoy whether I'm rich or whether I'm poor. Now, our summer only lasts for about 2 days, and then it's back to winter again. But those 2 days are really nice. But yeah, a happy society removes the price tag there is on happiness. A second factor was health. No big surprise, we can see longevity, a good life expectancy also predicts happiness levels, and we see those countries with high levels of happiness, there's also a high level of exercise in their population. In part in Copenhagen, that has to do with the cycling culture. But actually, I'd rather talk about mental health, because we can see that's a much bigger factor in a lot of countries in terms of delivering happiness to people. So these masks are Korean masks. They were given to me by a very inspirational young man I met in Korea. And he's created the Stella Foundation that tries to remove the stigma there is around mental illness. And as we already covered earlier, there's a real need for that in Korea. We do see, unfortunately, really high levels of suicide. You have the highest suicide level in OECD, around 24. And it's interesting to see those countries that are quite happy, Iceland, Australia, Sweden, Canada, are also the countries that have a really high level of consumption of antidepressants. Now, of course, it's not great that a large level of people feel they need antidepressants, but I think it's actually a good sign that people are seeking treatment, that people are acknowledging that there is treatment available, that we need to seek treatment, and there is a lesser taboo around mental illness. Because the thing is, Korea and Latvia, Estonia, there's low levels of consumption of antidepressants, but it's not that people are not depressed. I think it's just because they're not seeking treatment. So removing the stigma around mental illness, I think, is one of the most important things that a lot of countries, including Korea, could do. It's also something that Denmark has done. So Denmark used to have higher levels of suicide than Korea has currently. So we used to have the highest rate in the world for women. In 1980, our suicide rate peaked in Denmark, 32, and now fortunately it's down to 9 per 100,000. It's taken 3 decades, but one of the efforts have been to normalize the conversation around mental health. That role models like directors, models, intellectuals have come forward and talked about the mental health problems they have had and tried to normalize the conversation around mental illness. So I think that's a very important step that a lot of countries can do. A happy society removes the stigma around mental health. Then we can also see what predicts happy countries is low levels of corruption and high levels of trust. This is the level of trust in a range of different countries. And again, you'll see here, happier countries have higher levels of trust. You can measure trust in different ways. You can ask people directly, Do you feel that most people can be trusted, or can't you become too careful when it comes to strangers? That's one way. Another way is to go around cities and spot manifestations of trust. So this is from the streets of Copenhagen. We like to leave our kids outside in baby strollers when we're inside having a cup of coffee. To me, that's a manifestation of trust. You can also do studies where you drop wallets on streets. And scientists have done this, wallets containing cash and then ID papers, and then seeing how many of the wallets are returned with the money intact. And on average, globally, we see that 50% of wallets are returned with the cash still in the wallets. That's another manifestation of trust. And I think that trust comes from different sources. It comes from a low level of corruption, and it's great that Korea has a lot of focus on that these years, trying to reduce corruption in government and in terms of places of power. I only encourage that. We can also see that trust is also something that is built and taught in schools. So in a lot of the Nordic countries, you will have a holistic approach to education. Not just a focus on pure academic skills like science and math, but also on social skills like empathy and trust and the value of cooperation. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch about is freedom, because we can also see there is a high correlation between freedom and happiness. And you can measure freedom in different ways with freedom indexes, but I feel that a lot of these indexes often leave out a very important component of freedom, and that is how we spend our time. So we can see a good work-life balance also explains high levels of happiness in the Nordic countries. So 37-hour work weeks, long vacations, that is not just a policy thing, but it's also a culture. So in my office, which is an ordinary office in Copenhagen, people will leave work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's standard. And I think that's also an area where there can be some progress. The last time I was in South Korea, I spoke to one of the most brilliant young people I've met in recent years. And that person told me that he was looking for jobs outside Korea because he wanted to have dinner with his family. So he considered himself a happiness refugee. So I think if companies want to invest long-term in Korea and make sure that the great brain power you have here also remain in Korea, we need to make sure that people also have a better work-life balance than we usually see. Now this graph just shows some of the effect there is from family-friendly policies and work-life balance. This is the relationship or the difference there is in happiness levels between people who have kids and people that don't have kids. So in the US, which is on the right, you'll see that people who have kids are 12% less happy than people that do not have kids. In the left side, people who have kids are happier. So the thing here is not that the American kids are worse than the Portuguese kids, but it's just that the US lacks family-friendly policies. So we can actually see the effect of that. And you'll see Norway and Sweden and Finland, parents are happier than non-parents. So a happy society also focuses on building in a good balance between work and life. That was a very quick flyover. I know there's a lot of questions that are raised, and I also raised a few, hopefully, ideas for answers. But I think this is the most critical question that we can ask at this conference, in our companies, in our foundations, as policymakers, as city makers, and also as individuals. How do we convert wealth into well-being? So I look forward to continuing that conversation with you today and tomorrow. Thank you.